Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're able to join me for this discussion, trying to understand where Russia fits in the dynamic of U.S. national security considerations. So I'm going to, over the course of this discussion, try to walk you through some of the major points that I'd like you to leave with in understanding the depths and dynamic of the Russia challenge to U.S. national security, and what drives the Russian state, the Russian elite, to make the choices that they do, both for Russia as a country and then for the international system as a whole. My name is Nikolas Gvosdev. I'm a professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And I will be offering this set of ideas to you. And as a reminder, these are my own personal assessments of what I think matters and what I think that you, as rising national security professionals, need to know in a nutshell about the nature and essence of the Russia challenge. To frame my remarks, and whether this applies to Russia, to North Korea, to China, to any of our allies, partners, or adversaries in the world, I think it's really important that you take away this notion that former National Security Advisor General McMaster has outlined, this concept of strategic empathy. That is, that you need to understand, in this case with Russia, an adversary, a challenger, as they see things, how they see the world, not projecting what you think they ought to think or what you would like them to think, but how they actually operate. Not whether it's good or bad, whether you like it or don't like it, but to have a clear understanding of the nature of the Russian state, of the Russian elite, the worldview that they possess, the values that they put forward, how they define their interests. And this can be very different from what we as Americans would like to see or what we would prefer, or the question of mirror imaging. What would we do? And then we project that onto others. So that's the flip side of McMaster's concept of what he calls strategic narcissism, which is that we take our own way of looking at the world and project it on to someone else and expect that they should react and behave in the ways that we would want them to. And this is particularly important for dealing with Russia, a state in its various guises, from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union to the current-day Russian Federation, a state with which the United States has had, in some cases, partnership, in many cases, strategic rivalry and confrontation, that we get Russia right. And we get Russia right in the sense of understanding what the Russian government, elite, and people think of as important. Russia, of course, occupies a certain place in the American imagination and certainly in American popular culture. And we, of course, as Americans, have a whole set of reactions. So if I ask you at this point to think, what comes to mind when you hear the term Russia? What is the word association? And we have a whole panoply. We think Russia, cold, ice, snow, the prevalence of the bear as a classic Russian archetype, an animal archetype. We think of Russia as perhaps not as technologically advanced, or not certainly at the same level that the United States enjoys in terms of its material culture and well-being. And of course, for the last 25 years, the preeminent figure that many people associate with Russia has been Russia's long-serving president and prime minister, Vladimir Putin, who in many ways personifies Russia to an entire generation of people. In Russia, they refer to this as Generation P, that there are many Russians, particularly Russians under the age of 40, who have not known another leader again, whether in the guise of president or prime minister, other than Putin, and his somewhat outsized position in the world, and of course his perhaps most famous photograph that many of us are aware of him riding bare-chested a horse in the Siberian woods, which has become the archetypal image of Russia for many people. It's not that any of these are wrong or incorrect, but of course the issue can be if we allow these types of images and popular conceptions to cause us to either overestimate the Russia challenge or to underestimate the Russia challenge based upon these particular images. So as we move forward, I'd like to acknowledge that this is often how we think of Russia, but for us to be able to transcend that, to move beyond. And of course, Russia, particularly in the guise of the Soviet Union, if we think of the Soviet Union, and often we interchangeably referred to in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and Russia, although Russia was only one component of the Soviet Union, it was certainly the central component of the Soviet Union. One reason why it exercises such an influence on the American imagination and the American strategic imagination was that the Soviet Union was the only country in the modern era that had the capacity to existentially threaten the United States. Not just simply cause problems for the United States, but actually had the capacity to extinguish the United States as a nation. And during the Cold War, the United States lived with the reality that Russia, the Soviet Union, had the capacity to end the existence of the United States. No other country, even countries with which we've had important rivalries in the past, we think of the Axis powers in World War II, whether or not we conceive of China today, and China may be moving towards capacities like the Soviet Union possessed. But during the Cold War, the Soviet Union did threaten the United States in such a way, and that also leaves a legacy for us to consider as we move forward. But moving beyond these legacies, stereotypes, images, trying to get a sense of Russia as where does it fit? How is it as a challenger to the United States? What's the basis of its challenge to the United States? Let's spend a few minutes and look at Russia by the numbers. Russia is a country of 144 million people, so a little under half of the population of the United States. It is the 9th largest country in the world in terms of population. So while it's not a behemoth in terms of people in the way certainly we think of China or India or Indonesia, or even the United States itself, it still has a substantial human capital base. Moreover, the Russian population base, because Russia, and this is where its geography matters, the largest country in the world by land area, it is a country that straddles the core of what we would, as Americans, refer to as the Old World, which sometimes referred to as Eurasia. Russia, therefore, touches the Arctic, Europe, down into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia, and then, of course, shares a maritime border with the United States itself in the Far East between Kamchatka and the last bits of Russia into the Arctic and Bering Straits, and then, of course, bordering the United States in the maritime border at Alaska. What this has meant, though, is that Russia has a population base which draws on an enormous degree of diversity. While the core of Russia remains a Slavic East European nation-state core, Russia has assimilated throughout its 1,000-year of history of a wide variety of different population groups, religious groups, linguistic groups, and therefore has a population base which gives it access points to many of the other key regions of the world. Russia's economy goes back and forth, but at any given point, it's anywhere between the 8th to the 12th largest economy in the world, $2 trillion gross domestic product. If you prefer the purchasing power parity metric of $5.2 trillion economy. Russia is one of the countries in the world that is self-sufficient in food, in energy, in core commodities, in fresh water, all things which increasingly in the 21st century are points of contention and points of stress in many countries around the world. Russia enjoys a degree of self-sufficiency, which gives it both internal security but also leverage as an exporter of food, of energy, and of the critical commodities that we need to power and enjoy the modern lifestyle that we do. Russia is a nuclear power. It is the largest nuclear force in the world, both in terms of tactical and strategic weapons. It possesses a formidable nuclear infrastructure, both for weapons development and for power. Russia is also one of the world's leading spacefaring powers, ability to get its people and satellites away from Earth. So it has advantages into the space domain as well. Russia is one of the few countries that possesses genuine global power projection capabilities. Now, certainly not at the level that the United States does, certainly not in the numbers that the United States possesses, but Russia is one of the countries that can put military, conventional military, unconventional military forces pretty much anywhere in the world using its own resources. It doesn't have to depend on another country or a set of partners to be able to deploy forces. And that is a source of power and influence. In terms of where Russia is as an international player, it is, of course, one of the 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council of the United Nations, so no United Nations binding action can take place without Russia's acquiescence. So Russia has that power along with the United States, Britain, France, and China. It is a co-creator with China of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which between its members and its affiliates comprises most of the states of Central Asia, Eurasia, South and East Asia, and the Middle East. It is one of the progenitors of the Forum, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now with the inclusion of new members like Saudi Arabia into the BRICS Plus format. Of many of the non-Western major economies are in a forum where Russia has a degree of influence. And then as an energy producer, while Russia is not a member of OPEC itself, of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, it nevertheless is in a partnership known as OPEC Plus. So Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other major energy producers work together to regulate energy markets and, of course, to try to ensure that prices do not fall below acceptable levels. So Russia plays in a number of areas, not just simply in the military space, but in the geoeconomic and geopolitical spaces, where Russia is in a position to put checks on what America would like to see, to raise costs for the United States, and therefore it's a country that the United States has to continue to take seriously. In understanding Russia and understanding the Russian challenge, and why this is such an appropriate photograph, Russian President Putin in front of the map of Russia, is to understand that much of what defines Russia comes through its geographic position, how that geography has shaped the interests of the Russian state, how that geography has given advantages to Russia, how that geography has given disadvantages to Russia, and how and why it drives the strategic imperatives that a Russian government has. And I'd like to stress something here. It is often a point that Americans when they look at another country is to assume that if a country was more democratic, if it changed its form of government, it would be friendlier to the United States. And while there is some basis to that you can see how governments that share values can begin to work closer together, there are also certain fixed interests, often defined by geography, that set an agenda for a government that no matter who sits in Moscow, whether it was the Tsar, whether it was the Soviet Communist Party, the Politburo and the General Secretary, whether it's democratically or semi-democratically elected presidents of the Russian Federation, the geography of Russia doesn't change, the core interests of Russia have not changed, and that therefore any Russian leader has to grapple with a set of challenges that are not going to be as dependent on what form of government Russia possesses. And that's an important thing as you're evaluating, as you're studying and looking at the question of Russia as a strategic challenger to the United States, areas where a future Russia might be more of a strategic partner again to the United States, is understanding the hand that Russia has been dealt with and how that drives the Russian grand strategic approach. So I would argue that, again, no matter who sits in the Kremlin, there are a number of grand strategic imperatives which are going to drive how Russia interacts with the rest of the world and how it is going to view the United States. Does the United States help or hinder any of these major objectives? And the first is that the Russian establishment, not just Putin, but the Russian political establishment, the military establishment, the diplomatic establishment, have largely a very realist view of how international politics works, of how the international system functions. Many of us in the United States like to think of the international system as something that can be benign, that we can develop rules, just as we have rules and laws for internal domestic regulation, that countries can cooperate and benefit. The starting point from the Russian political establishment is that there are two conditions that any state faces in the world. You're either pushing outward and setting agendas for others, or others are pushing in on you and trying to impose their agenda and their preferences on you. And therefore, international politics is not as much about finding cooperative mechanisms. It is about finding a balance where you have a sufficient degree of power where you can prevent others from dictating to you, and you have the ability to, at least regionally, and if not then globally, have a voice in how regional and global affairs will take place. And the Russian state maintains that if Russia weakens, if it loses capabilities, if it loses power, it does not expect that in a world where China or the United States are the dominant powers, that Russia's interests will necessarily be respected or guaranteed, and that you have to therefore maintain a degree of power and influence. And as we'll see in the Russian context, a lot of this is translated into control over physical territory, physical geography, as a way of creating buffer zones, spheres of influence, which allow you to hold at bay the pressures that other major power blocks can bring against you. The ability to maintain, and going back just for a moment to this map, not just the borders of Russia, but that larger Eurasian space, the idea that in that space, Russia needs to be the primary player. And Russian officials will often talk about this, just as the United States had a Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere, that the United States maintained that it should be the predominant power setting the agenda for the Western Hemisphere. Russia seeks the same for the Eurasian space. And of course, keep in mind that when Russia makes this claim, it's not necessarily concerned whether the neighboring states agree to that or not, whether or not they wish to be part of a larger Russian sphere. It's assumed that a major power needs this in order to be a major power and player in the world system. And finally, as we'll see, Russia traditionally has been on the periphery of the major engines of the global economy, the major centers of innovation and development, and therefore making sure that Russia is not left behind, that Russia has the technological and financial resources to be able to modernize and develop its economy, to keep the economy in a position where it can sustain the national security demands of the Russian state. This is vital to how the Russian government sees one of its core missions, that the economy has to be developed sufficiently to produce the types of power that Russia needs to sustain itself in the international system. So why are these the drivers for Russian grand strategy? And a lot of it has to do with the hand that Russia has been dealt. And if we look at the 194 countries in the world, we can see that countries don't all start out equally. Every country, in essence, it's like a card game, is dealt a hand of cards. And these cards that you're dealt with can be the environmental and climatic location where your country is located. Are you in an earthquake zone? Are you in a zone that floods easily? Are you in a zone where fresh water is hard to come by? What's the ability of your cropland to grow the food that you need to feed your population? Do you have access points to global markets? Can your access to the rest of the world be choked off? What's your natural resource endowment? Do you have commodities? Do you have sufficient sources of energy? Do you have a degree of natural security? It's hard for people to invade you or not to invade you. So when we look at the hand that the Russian state has been dealt with over the last 1,000 years, we can see that it gets a mixed hand. There are some things about it that are very important. Russia, of course, has, as we noted before, it's energy independent, energy self-sufficient. It is a great deal of commodities, minerals, things that we need, any country needs to power and maintain its economy. But that the Russian state, because of where it's located in Eurasia, has a number of negatives. And Russian grand strategy has always been about how do we mitigate these negatives. First is the multiple routes for land invasion. The core of the Russian state sits on the core of the Eurasian steppe, the flat plains that run from the center of Europe to China. Traditionally, very few natural defenses against invasion. Geography doesn't necessarily help you by giving you, in the way that geography helps Switzerland with its mountains, or geography has traditionally helped England with the English Channel and the oceans, and of course the United States with the two great oceans, the two great moats of the Atlantic and the Pacific, traditionally shielding the United States from major invasion by major powers. The Russian state has not benefited from that, and therefore this push and pull. How far do you have to push out for security? How much can you give up before your core security is jeopardized? And this has been a back and forth in modern Russian history for the last 500 years. And it explains why in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region, we see borders shifting back and forth. We see Russia projecting outward, Russia being contained back within, and that these questions never seem to be definitively settled because geography does not readily lend itself to creating what are called natural frontiers. Russia is very open to land invasion, but historically it's difficult for Russia to access the major economic centers of the world, particularly by sea. If we think of the Arctic Ocean, until recently largely frozen, the Baltic coastline often closed to Russia, the Black Sea coastline often closed to Russia. The Caspian Sea is not a sea that leads to any other body of water, so it doesn't really help you to control the Caspian Basin. And then, of course, while Russia has a Pacific coastline, it is far from the core centers of the Russian state. One of the points that has been a driver in the past for Russian security, and it may seem odd given that I opened by noting that today Russia is food sufficient and in fact is a food exporter, but Russia's initial position before it began large periods of expansion was that it was gripped by food instability, that the core Russian lands are not particularly fertile. You have a short growing season. You are subject to the vicissitudes of frost and winter, killing crops, and historically, in the Middle Ages, Russia often teetered on the risk of famine. This politically, as we're going to see in a moment, was one of the contributors to the development of a much more centralized and autocratic form of government in Russia, both the threat of invasion and the threat of famine, requiring that you had a relatively strong executive who could order things in order to try to provide for security against invasion and then to deal with the threat of famine. So this becomes a driver for a more autocratic Russian political culture that emerges over several centuries. Of course, harsh climate, that you have to deal with real variations in climate, and that for at least several months in the winter, that you deal perhaps with parts of the country effectively being cut off, where travel is very difficult. And of course, again, the risks that this poses to maintaining the safety and security of your population. And then finally, traditionally, the core of the Russian state was distant from the main centers of global innovation, global development. And so the sense of Russia being isolated, being backwards, and that again, in military terms, historically what this has meant for Russia is being exposed to invasion by military forces that are better equipped and have better military technologies. And so how does Russia close those gaps? How does Russia gain the military resources for itself? This was also a driver for the development of a more authoritarian Russian political culture. Just wanted to briefly, since you can't really give justice to the full panoply of Russian history, but to identify four figures out of the Russian past, which can help to provide some context for how Russia sees itself and how Russia sees where it ought to be located and why it is involved in parts of the world even when people that live in those parts of the world may not want Russia to be involved in their affairs. And certainly we are seeing this in real time in Ukraine today. The upper left figure, Grand Prince Vladimir, in Ukrainian Volodymyr, the ruler of Rus, which was a federation of city-states and tribes and principalities 1,000+ years ago that straddled much of western and northern Russia, a good part of what is today Ukraine and Belarus. This is seen by Russians as the progenitor of the modern Russian state and nation. This is part of the Russian claim, the idea that all of this part of Eastern Europe essentially should be united under a single government. And of course, Vladimir is known for his adoption of Orthodox Christianity to provide a common religious identity to this land of Rus, and the idea that he creates a legacy which then future leaders are going to claim, being the heirs of Saint Vladimir. And this, of course, is the beginnings, even to this day, of the notion of who are the Russians, how do they relate to nationalities like the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, how do they relate to other national and religious groups across the Eurasian space. To the upper right is a 15th century Grand Prince and Duke of Moscow, Ivan III. Why he is important 600 some years later to our discussions is Ivan III said, it's not enough for me to rule this one piece of this lands of Rus that Vladimir had presided over. It's my job to begin gathering in all of the lands. That was the approach that he set out, that Moscow it wasn't enough just to have one principality of Moscow, that Moscow should expand and begin absorbing all the other lands of Rus, as many as could be absorbed, so other states in northern Russia, and then the idea that the lands that are part of Ukraine or Belarus should also be absorbed in around Moscow as much as possible. And that in the process of expanding to bring about this gathering of the land, that for the security of that land, you may actually need to then continue to expand to create more buffer zones, to create more territory, to create a safer core around the Muscovite center. And so Ivan III starts a process that subsequent Russian rulers will continue of gathering, annexing, absorbing, growing the size of the Russian state. At the bottom left-hand side, Catherine II, Catherine the Great, 18th century Empress of Russia, in many ways, even more than her predecessor, Peter the Great, sets the foundation for a integrated Eurasian-based Russian empire. It's under her rule that Russia expands definitively into the center of Europe or into the heart of Europe through the partitions of Poland, extends the Russian Empire to the shores of the Black Sea. Many of the areas that are being fought, where fighting is occurring today in Ukraine, are the territories that Catherine acquired for the Russian Empire and developed. Catherine also started Russia on its pathward towards the Middle East, towards the Mediterranean, and continued a process of expansion and consolidation of Russian power all the way to the Pacific shores and to the borders of China. So it was under Catherine, really, that the shape of Russia and the notion of Russia now as this multinational empire which connects Europe to Asia, really in the process of her reign takes definitive shape. And finally, to bring us into the 20th century, I could have put Vladimir Lenin, who led the Bolshevik Revolution, which creates the Soviet Union, but in many ways, his successor as General Secretary of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin, is someone who bequeaths the modern legacy of Russia as the Soviet Union as an industrialized power, as a major global player, sets the basis at an enormous human cost, both in terms of the Second World War, but in terms of collectivization and industrialization of the Soviet Union. Perhaps 40 to 50 million people losing their lives in the process of constructing the Soviet Union essentially as the world's second superpower. So Stalin creates this legacy of Russia, the Soviet Union, seeing itself as truly one of the two powers that sets the global agenda and is able to move forward in defining world politics. And so Stalin's legacy, which remains controversial in Russia to this day, on the one hand, people acknowledging the enormous human cost of his tenure as the head of the Soviet Union, but also people looking to him as having created the basis for this modern world power in the policies that he's pursued. So these are the four figures that, in a way, help define the contemporary Russian outlook. And this idea of Russia, sort of, as I said, you push out or you're pushed in on, and the growth of the Russian state. So this is in the 17th century, that the Russian state literally expanding across Eurasia is going to absorb, it's going to build defensive lines, it's going to look for how does it control lines of communication, how does it secure itself against invasion. If you see Moscow at the top center, how do you sort of protect that core from attack? And the idea that you're going to keep pushing outward, and you're going to push and try to push until either you hit a natural barrier or you hit such a level of resistance that you then get a stable border. This is built into the DNA of Russian strategic thinking, of pushing outward, finding security in geographic space, protecting the core from being able to be assaulted by others. And this is something that really you should take away when you're considering the challenge that Russia poses in the world. Right? And again, the idea of the Russian core is subject to invasion. And again, when we look at this map, you can see the extent to which Russia has to grapple with threats and challenges from a wide number of states and areas of the world. The United States, of course, we are expeditionary, and we look at the world in the context of our combatant commands and of our State Department regional bureaus, and so we divide the world up and we have a regional focus. Russia has a regional focus as well, not because the Russians are as expeditionary, but because so many different parts of the world have the possibility to impinge on Russia. So all the way from the Far East, from Japan, Korea, China, to South Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, Central Europe, Northern Europe to the Arctic. And so this forces Russia to be, whether Russia wants to or not, Russia has to be usually a global player. It has to be active in many regions of the world. It does not see itself solely as a European power. The United States groups Russia in the European command, obviously, because the primary challenge that Russia has posed to the United States has been in the European theater. But don't fall into the mistake of thinking that because we group Russia into the European command, that Russia somehow is primarily or exclusively interested in Europe. And as you can see, Russia is going to be very concerned with many other regions of the world, and then thinking beyond this immediate zone of ways in which it can ensure its security. So when you're looking at Russia, and you're looking at trying to get at its political system, strategic culture, and on the one hand, we don't want to fall into a type of ethnic determinism that says that people are defined solely by their cultural and political backgrounds. But on the other hand, we don't want to fall into the trap that so often we do that assumes that everyone more or less can and does see the world the same way as Americans do, or as former President George W. Bush once said, inside everyone there's an American seeking to get out. And understanding that what has defined Russia as a state, a nation, as a society, this term teleurocracy, literally meaning a land state or a land power, that Russia has defined itself by this gathering process, that the Russian state and the Russian identity is based on this notion of gathering of lands and gathering of peoples, that you put a lot of emphasis on land power, that the Russian state self-colonized itself, that as it expanded, it would send colonists, it would encourage people to move, to settle new territories, it would expand and absorb neighboring groups and states, so that as Russia gets put together, it absorbs a wide variety of ethnic and religious groups and different political entities. That the Russian state and Russian culture is often defined by a degree of cultural conservatism. Innovation can be seen as something that is risky. Change can be risky. A core part of kind of Russian political thinking is, as bad as something may be, it can always get worse as opposed to get better. And therefore, we sometimes look at the situation and we look at conditions there and we think, wow, Americans wouldn't tolerate this. Americans would push for change, because there's an American optimism that says if something is bad, you can change it for the better. The Russian experience has often been, if something is bad and it changes, it may actually get worse. And therefore, do you want to risk change? And so what we've seen as a component of Russian political culture is both this conservatism and a distrust of change. As I mentioned before, Russia as a state early on, when it was a grouping of principalities and it was separated, it was vulnerable to invasion, it was vulnerable to famine, it was vulnerable to climactic disruption, and this created a tradition of strong centralized power as a basis for national survival, and that the strength of the Russian center, even though Russia today technically is a federation, it is not certainly not as decentralized as the United States. And there is, again, there's not much of a risk appetite for wanting to weaken that central authority if you think that the outcome will be worse. From the naval perspective, we do need to note this. Russia traditionally was not a major naval power. Historically, the Rus, so 1,000 years ago, based upon their connections with the Vikings, the early Rus did have the ability to traverse the Black Sea. But historically, for much of its history, Russia did not have much of a naval tradition. And even when the Russians began to develop both a military navy, one of their first major commanders was John Paul Jones. After his service in the American Revolution, he put himself out for hire and was hired by Empress Catherine the Great, to be a Russian naval commander. And that the Russians often turned, and going to this point about absorbing and expanding different groups, is the Russians turned to more commercial nationalities, for example, Greeks, to help create and maintain a basis for Russian shipping and Russian naval commerce. So there isn't as much of a strong naval tradition, although it has developed as an auxiliary to Russian security. But again, Russia sees its primary power as land-based, and therefore naval power has always been an annex to, or is meant to be supporting to Russian core power, which exists on land. Finally, the last point about a tellurocracy, and this is a term that's used by Alexander Dugin, who is a Russian grand strategic thinker, very influential in Russian political and military circles these days, is to point out that this type of state has the ability to develop and generate military power from a much lower economic base. So sometimes you'll hear people telling you, well, Russia isn't really that much of a problem because its GDP, its economy, is the same size as Italy. And we don't look at Italy as a major economic player that can be a superpower. And therefore, if the Russian economy isn't as big as the United States or as China, and if it's the size of the Italian economy or the Portuguese economy, it must not be a threat. That is a very dangerous assumption for you to have, because the Russian state for several centuries has demonstrated that even with a smaller economy, with this degree of strong centralized bureaucratic authority, it can extract what it needs from the economy to field a much better military force and to project power. So don't fall into the trap of looking at the Russian raw economic data and assuming that the United States wouldn't be able to support a military with an economy the size of Italy or Portugal. Therefore, Russia cannot support the type of military that would be a threat to the United States. This is a core part of how Russia projects power, is its ability to generate and sustain military power from a much smaller economic base. So, bringing Peter the Great in here, because, of course, Peter's portrait is one of the ones that Vladimir Putin keeps in his office. Not this particular portrait, but he does have a portrait of Peter the Great. This idea that Russia expands to its natural powers, you secure access points to the Russian core, you make sure that you have absorbed natural resource bases and industrial zones, and you create a clear sphere of influence. And you can see all four of these at work in Ukraine. That for the Russian state, either absorbing Ukraine or making sure that Ukraine is in a dependent relationship to Russia is part of these four imperatives. Pushing outward the zone of Russian control, making sure that the Russian core is less vulnerable, absorbing important natural resource and industrial zones into the Russian economic orbit, and then part of this notion of gathering in and creating a Russian sphere of influence. So we can see that these geopolitical imperatives translate into policy choices and decisions that are made by the Russian state. And then as Russia looks further, and this is where geopolitics becomes important, the Russian establishment is a geopolitically oriented establishment. It looks at who controls strategic real estate, what points of strategic real estate are important, and how does this create the basis for competition within the international system. And so Russia has always, again, viewed itself, it's a core Eurasian heartland, but that it is always concerned about the ability to be isolated, surrounded, losing those points of access. And you can see on this map especially that these access points in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, the ability to access into the Indian Ocean, into the Mediterranean Ocean, access into the Pacific, that the Russian state is going to be concerned about making sure that it is not constrained inward. And it will want a series of relationships with the states in yellow, starting with China, starting with Germany, and Turkey, that will allow it to mitigate those negative points. And to the extent that it views the United States, and if we think of who the core US allies and partners are in the world, also we are looking to make sure that we preserve a maritime connectivity. We want to make sure that the United States, the Indo-Pacific basin, the Euro-Atlantic basin are all open and at best friendly, integrated into the US core, and at minimum to make sure that no heartland power, whether it be Russia, Soviet Union, Russia, and China together, can dominate more of that part of the world. This sets up the basis for a degree of geopolitical tension, right? And so again, also from the United States' point of view, when we look at the world and we look at who our allies and partners are, we have always been very concerned with making sure from our North American base that no heartland power can negatively impact U.S. political and economic interests in what is usually referred to as the Rimland. And therefore, if the United States, primarily through sea power, through maritime power, confronts Russia and China as land powers, although China also developing a maritime power, it's not accidental that if the United States is in a degree of competition with Russia, with China, of where the points of conflict, where the points of flashpoints might exist, and that is where sea and land power begin to intersect with each other. Now, it's important to note that the fact that Russia is a land power and the United States has been a maritime power doesn't automatically mean that the two countries are fated to be confrontational. And in fact, for much of the early US-Russia history in the 18th and 19th centuries, the geopolitical imperatives of the United States and Russia were often aligned, in that the United States saw Russia as a useful counterweight to hostile European powers like Britain and France. Russia looked at the United States as a trading partner, as a balancer in Europe and in parts of Asia, and that the United States and Russia, and in this case, Abraham Lincoln, in this cartoon, Abraham Lincoln meeting with, did not physically meet with Tsar Alexander II, Emperor Alexander II, but the idea that there was, between Lincoln and Alexander, and in their relationship, there was a sense that the United States and Russia could work together, even with their systems being different, their systems of government being different. So it's not automatic that the fact that Russia's land power imperatives and America's maritime imperatives have to mean confrontation, but it does mean a willingness then to regulate, a willingness to compromise, and the problem has often been when Washington and Moscow have defined their interests vis-a-vis each other in ways that does not necessarily permit some degree of compromise and meeting in the middle. The Russian preference, and we saw this all the way through Putin's speech that he gave right before restarting major combat operations in Ukraine in 2022, is again a very realist approach of dividing the world. So this is the famous napkin proposal in 1944 between Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. It was an attempt to essentially divide up Europe into spheres of influence and percentages. What percentage would the Soviet Union get? What percentage would the West get? And from the Russian establishment's point of view, this is the way that they would like to run things in the world. Sit down with the United States and essentially create spheres of influence. The problem, of course, from the US side is we believe very strongly in self-determination. We try to encourage the spread of democratic governments. And therefore, we don't want a world in which major powers are making decisions and other states are essentially told, you have no voice, and we're not going to take what you want into account. And so the ability today, which is, would the United States sit down with Russia and say we will work out spheres of influence, is something that the United States has rejected, continues to reject, as this is not a model in which the United States sees this as a way, going back to here, to try to regulate US-Russia relations in the world. And in fact, the United States, really, since the end of the Cold War, has been hoping that Russia would come into partnership with the United States alongside the enlargement of the Euro-Atlantic world. And really, US policy towards Russia over the last 30 years was proceeding along an assumption that the zone, the Euro-Atlantic zone, would enlarge. More states would come into NATO, more states would come into the European Union, and that at the same time Russia would be coming into the Western world as a partner, and that there would not be contradictions, because either Russia itself would follow this path of development, or if it didn't, it wouldn't matter because Russia would not be that strong of a country anymore. Russia would not have the ability to block the enlargement of the Euro-Atlantic world. And the third option, which is that Russia would not seek to join the West, would try to preserve a sphere of influence, and that Russia would still have a degree of political, economic, and military power to challenge enlargement, was not something that the United States prepared for. It was not one of the options on the policy dance card. And that's in a way also what we are grappling with today, which is a reality that Russia, the current Russian government and establishment, does not look at the enlargement of the Western world as in their interests, that they are willing to risk war and to take on the costs of war, certainly as we see in Ukraine, and that it is not a question of, well, if we persuade them, this is why we come back to McMaster, why I opened with McMaster and strategic narcissism versus strategic empathy. It's not a question of, well, if we just explain it better to Russia, that somehow they'll understand that our interests are benign and what we seek to do doesn't threaten them, because they view these as a core threat to their interests. And they also have a sense that the United States would be prepared or would be interested then, if the United States wants to continue with this, is the end result that the United States would want to see change of regime in Russia, or even a change in Russia's own status or ability to project power, right? That if Russia is not going to agree to this, the two policy options is either you stop enlargement and you do go back to that Churchillian napkin where you say we will expand up to this point, but everything beyond, no. Or you have to get back to that second bullet point. You have to find ways to diminish Russian power in such a way that Russia cannot challenge the results. And that is, in essence, what we are seeing now in the current struggle that's occurring in Ukraine. Right? Because the Russian view is that what happened after the Cold War, right, is that we look at this enlargement process as we are expanding a zone of peace and prosperity. The 1990s was not a period of peace and prosperity for Russia in the post-Soviet collapse. And there's a sense that the United States was not interested in a strong Russia. They wanted a weak Russia in order to, again, if you view the world as you push out or you're pushed in on, from the Russian strategic viewpoint, this is a pushing in on Russia. And that you don't trust the benign intentions of the United States. And again, when we look at countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, if you have been thinking about them as part of your gathering in, that's why I referred you to Ivan III, if you view these territories as, well, they really should be connected to Russia in some way, then efforts to bring them into the West, by definition, is extracting them or pulling them out of the Russian sphere, and therefore is viewed as a hostile set of policies by the Russian establishment. So we've tried, and there have been efforts to try over the last 20 years, as I said, Putin has been president or prime minister, are there ways in which the United States and Russia could work this out? And a lot of it has to do, and this is something in your educational experiences that you'll have here and ongoing throughout the rest of your careers in the national security field, is why we spend time looking at cognitive mental maps of leaders. And we look at Putin's mental map, and the mental map that Putin has, which is shared by his associates and his subordinates. So it's not just a question of one individual, but it's a question of an establishment, that it can be difficult for the United States to find common ground if you're dealing with a leadership that thinks of the world in terms of 19th century arrangements, which is great powers meet, you pull out the maps, you divide into spheres of influence. If you don't think in terms of international law, but you think in terms of swaps and trades and compromises. And then finally, this last point, which is that weaker states in the international system are agenda takers, not agenda setters, not agenda makers. And of course, in the Russian view, smaller states should accept what the bigger states do. And of course, this is also why Russia is afraid of becoming a weaker state, why it will take steps, because it feels that if it weakens, it too will be in this position where it has to accept the agenda of others. Given that Russia is not the Soviet Union, smaller population base, economy, as we mentioned, between 8th to 12th in the world, but not a one-to-one match. This is going to lead Russia, if it's trying to frustrate the United States, if it's trying to limit what the US can do in the world, if it's going to try to raise costs, to really look at asymmetric ways in which it can, for a smaller investment, create problems to distract the United States, drain resources. And when we look at this, what's sometimes referred to as the arc of instability, and we look at Russia trying to create issues and limits for the US, whether it's supporting insurgencies, weaponizing migration, using private military companies in places like Libya or Niger or the Central African Republic, ways in which Russia can put pressure on the United States and on its European allies, and then to be able to bargain and to say, we can help you solve these problems if you want to talk with us, but if you don't, then we'll find ways to create issues and problems for you. And so it's not accidental, again, this arc of instability where we look where over the last 10 years, from Ukraine to Syria to Libya, where Russian involvement has been to create economic problems, migration problems, political problems that force a diversion of US attention and resources, and that Russia is not incentivized to solve or help solve problems if it means that the United States can say, thank you for helping us solve problems in other parts of the world. We now have more time and attention to focus on you. And by the way, behind this is a strategic logic from China. So when you're studying and looking at China, that a China that wants to divert and distract the United States is going to be very interested in making sure that Russia is in a position to divert and distract the United States in theaters other than the Indo-Pacific, starting with Europe, the Arctic, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. So this idea of diverting, distracting, causing the United States to have to spread its attention and its resources is at the core of Russian strategy. And that as this occurs as well, I mentioned the Arctic briefly, that as the Arctic opens up, something very important to Russian interests, both in terms of the resources, right? So part of it is that Russia wants resources, it wants control of access points, is that Russia is investing much more in its ability to operate in the Arctic. And again, assuming that the United States is not going to be able to match those capabilities because the United States is spread out in so many different theaters and parts of the world. So partly what you're going to be dealing with in your careers as you move forward, not just with Russia, with China, with other issues, are questions of prioritization and questions of platforms and strategies that can be used in multiple places, multiple conditions. Because part of the Russian assessment is that Russia doesn't have to spend a lot to be very effective in the Arctic, but to use that as a point of pressure against the United States and Europe. And this is encapsulated in sort of recent Russian grand strategy approaches, and that the current chief of staff of the general staff, General Gerasimov, that the idea that a state, and a state like Russia, cannot compete head-to-head with the US, and that a head-to-head competition with the US is one where the US has advantages. So going asymmetrically, non-military means, still having military force, but really using all of the tools of national power to try to constrain, inflict costs on the United States, is very much a part of this Russian approach. Staying underneath the level of open warfare, Ukraine being an exception, avoid triggering alliance commitments, use of sharp power tools to try to penetrate the West. And this brings us to the notion that the Russian challenge isn't just simply something that you measure in terms of tanks and planes and ships. You're also looking at the ability of a country to focus on your own domestic political life and institutions. And that the Russians have concluded that if the United States is certainly still the most powerful country in the world, and you don't want that power directed against you, then it's in your interest to make sure that that country is focused more inward, doesn't want to go abroad as much, wants to reduce its commitments. So part of Russia remaining very active in terms of intervening and playing in US domestic politics and the politics of particularly our European allies, finding ways to create costs and using whatever tools of power are available. Putin, as I mentioned, gave this speech in 2022. Still an important address for encapsulating the Russian viewpoint, how they're viewing the world, that they are in a prolonged cycle, not just of competition, but confrontation with the United States, that they view US activity as a threat, that it has to be pushed back. Capacity of the United States to intervene needs to be dropped. The US needs to be balanced. Russia needs to encourage more centers of power to develop that can raise costs for the United States. And from the Russian view, that this is existential to Russia, it's existential to the regime, and it's existential to the country as a whole. And because it's viewed as an existential threat, we again see the ability of Russia, the Russian state, to generate the resources that it's needed. So even though there are sanctions on Russia, even though parts of the standard of living have been impacted, the Russian state is mobilizing itself to prepare for what it sees as a long-term cycle of confrontation with the United States. And despite the sanctions, despite all the losses that have been inflicted on Russia over the past 2 years, Russia is transitioning to a war economy and is transitioning to the ability to sustain that war economy, at least in the short to medium term. And this has to be then part of our strategic thinking. We're always looking for that silver bullet, regime change, sudden collapse. The Russian state and the Russian establishment are preparing for a long-haul competition. And they're trying to encourage a partner in China to say that it's in China's interest to make sure that Russia can sustain this level, and to encourage other countries to not necessarily join Russia, but not necessarily to help the US effort. And so that Russia can sustain this position for the foreseeable future. You'll be, in the course of your studies, being focused, having some very detailed looks at China, the rise of China, what drives the Chinese strategic establishment. But there are some points of overlap with Russia that Russia has been encouraging over the past number of years, that both China and Russia can challenge aspects of the American-led international system, that they're both concerned about ensuring that their regimes are secure against Western pressure, that they can trade with each other as a way to offset U.S. ability to impose sanctions and costs, and that they can work more to develop capabilities that can balance or raise costs for the United States. So this is not an alliance. It's a strategic partnership, or an entente, if we want to use the French word. But it matters because right now, both Russia and China see benefit to both of them to continue this level of cooperation, and that they both view that they are in competition with the United States, and that they want to ensure that they can prevail in aspects of that competition with the United States. At the end of the day, for the Russian side, why does this matter? The Russian fear, or the fear starting with Putin and his associates, that the United States, if given the opportunity, would not stand aside to prevent regime change or overthrow, that the United States would not be averse to an outcome where Putin would be overthrown and his regime dismantled. And the Russian establishment is concerned about a future in which Russia is not an agenda-setting nation, but where the different regions of Russia, different parts of Russia, end up being pulled into the sphere of influence of other major powers. So while Russia has a relationship with China today, Russia is, of course, concerned in the long term that could China overawe Russia? Could parts of Russia be pulled into where the European Union and the United States would be predominant, other parts of Russia that would be more connected to the Middle East, and the Russian state would cease to be an agenda setter, and the Russian elite would not be able to manage and profit from the base, the resource and commodities base of Russia. That in essence, subdividing Russia would mean that the benefits and riches of Russia would be flowing out to power centers outside of Russia, so that the Russian elite, not just Putin himself, but the Russian elite would be incentivized to prevent this from happening. And the extent to which Ukraine is one of those battlefields to try to prevent the fragmentation of Russia itself. So to leave you with this overview is take Russia seriously. Don't see the Russians as 10 feet tall, unstoppable, but don't underestimate their capacities to regenerate military power and economic power, and that we have to deal with the reality that Russia, the Russian establishment, the Russian state, Putin, view themselves in competition with the United States, and not a friendly competition, but a confrontational competition with the potential for zero-sum outcomes. And so as you are continuing your studies and as you continue to move through the ranks and assume more senior positions in the national security establishment, this is going to be one of the challenges, the persistent challenges that will trickle down to the various communities and pieces of the national security mission that you'll be assigned to. And it's going to be part of your professional future for the foreseeable future, and therefore paying attention to it, understanding it, and knowing both where the challenges are to us, but also where we have advantages that can be brought to bear. All of this is going to be important both for your own personal success, but also for the long-term strategic interests of the United States. Thank you.